I really think that when talking about a niche such as this one, like the TCO regulation, and specifically a niche of target audience like micro and small host service providers, this cooperation among initiatives, cooperation with member states, national authorities, and among projects and European Commission is very valuable.
As an HSP, it may be very useful to carry out a risk assessment based on the services you provide, but in many cases, it is important to understand that terrorist actors use sophisticated and evolving strategies and techniques to disseminate propaganda online, which requires the use of different types of platforms.
Hi, and welcome back to the Tech Terror Takedown podcast. I'm your host, Sophia Rothut, a researcher at LME Munich, working on the EU-funded TAPE project. Today's episode is focusing on the TCO project cluster, which comprises 3 EU-funded projects: Allies, FRISCO, and us from TAPE. Each of these projects is dedicated to supporting hosting service providers, or HSPs, in tackling terrorist content online while ensuring compliance with the European TCO Regulation. Drawing on the recent episode with my colleagues Professor Stuart MacDonald and Dr. Miraj Mohammed from the TAPE project, we will discuss challenges HSPs face, as well as tips and best practices our 2 sister projects, Allies and FRISCO, encountered and learned within the previous 2 years. I'm delighted to be joined by 2 representatives from those 2 sister projects who will share their insights from working on these important tasks. First, I'd like to introduce Serena Bianchi, a research project manager at Sivignon. Serena is responsible for the management and implementation of several EU-funded research projects with a focus on counter-terrorism, radicalization prevention, and disaster management. In the Allies project, she serves as the Dissemination and Communication Work Package Lead, and today she will be sharing the challenges faced and lessons learned from Allies. Welcome, Serena. Very nice to have you.
Thank you, Sophia. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks again for inviting me.
Next, I'm thrilled to introduce Pierre Sivignon, who has degrees in political science and is a project manager and analyst at Civipol. Pierre specializes in preventing and countering violent extremism, and he works on several EU-funded projects that focus on disrupting terrorist activities online while protecting human rights, such as the FRISCO project, where Pierre is currently working to implement that project on behalf of Civipol, and he is leading its dissemination and exploitation activities. Welcome, Pierre. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your invitation, Sophia. I'm also glad to be here.
Thank you both for being here today. I'm excited to dive into our discussion and learn more about the valuable work you're doing through these projects. Let's begin by introducing your respective projects. Serena, could you start by giving us a brief overview of the Allies project?
Yes, absolutely. Again, thank you very much for being here. I think being part of this podcast is extremely important to raise awareness on the TCO regulation and terrorist content online regulation. As you mentioned before, I'm representing today Allies project, which is an abbreviation for Artificial Intelligence-Based Framework for supporting macro and small host service providers on the report and removal of online terrorist content. And as the title may already highlight, the project is funded by the European Commission under the Internal Security Fund program, and is designed to support micro and small host service providers in achieving compliance with the terrorist content online regulation. In fact, one of the threats that Europe is facing in the last year and always growing is the misuse of internet in order to spread and communicate terrorist content online. And therefore, the European Commission and the European Union have done a lot of work in order to counter this threat, especially by implementing what we are going to discuss today, which is the terrorist content online regulation. As you can understand, big service providers such as Meta or X are put normally in an easier position in order to remove terrorist content from their platforms. However, when we talk about micro and small host service providers, the story is a bit different because they don't have, most of the time, they don't have the technical or the human resources in order to counter the spreading of online terrorist content. And therefore, Allies wants to act exactly as support, as initiative for supporting micro and small host service providers in detecting and removing terrorist content online. How it has been done as part of the project. So we basically worked on some main pillars. The first one is creating awareness, allowing our target audience, meaning mostly micro and small host service providers, in understanding what is the TCO regulation, what is the threat that they may encounter when talking about spreading of terrorist content online. The second pillar is creating training activities, allowing them to educate, also based on the knowledge that we have gathered as part of the project activities for what concern terrorist content online. And also, as mentioned in the title as well of the project itself, we developed artificial intelligence-based tools to detect and remove terrorist content online. So we want to serve, let's say, this specific target audience in better complying with the regulation, of the TCO regulation that has been established by on a European Union level.
Thank you, Serena. Pierre, could you introduce the FRISCO project and its main goals?
With pleasure. So, as Serena recalled it, the measures imposed by the TCO regulation, such as the removal of flagged terrorist content in 1 hour, for instance, may represent an important burden for HSPs, and especially for micro and small ones who have fewer resources than the bigger players. And this is where the FRISCO project steps in. So our project has been designed to respond to this challenge, and in other words, to help micro and small HSPs comply with the TCO regulation, alleviate their operational burdens, foster multi-stakeholder collaborations and partnerships, and ultimately, of course, create a safer online environment. So the FRISCO project, FRISCO standing for Fighting Terrorist Content Online, began in 2022 and will end soon in November 2024. So it has been carried out by a team of 8 European organizations: the French Ministry of the Interior, Civipol, the National Center of Scientific Research, Democritos, TREMO, Violence Prevention Network, the European Digital Learning Network, ETS, the International Network Against Cyber Hate, and finally, IVSZ, which is the ICT Association of Hungary. So what are we actually doing to support this micro and small HSPs? In a nutshell, through 3 main types of activities: awareness raising first. We inform them about their new obligations; tools productions. We develop tools, frameworks, and mechanisms to ease their compliance and content moderation processes; and knowledge sharing. So we share information, experiences, and best practices. All our activities are actually based on an initial study published in early 2023, which aimed to identify the needs of HSPs and understand their level of awareness of the TCO regulation. This study is still available on our website for anyone interested. And based on our initial findings, we have worked on several key resources, all of which are freely available on our website as well. A toolbox composed of 3 tools that really complement each other. We have a self-assessment questionnaire, a process map, and a content moderation tool. Then we've got a training platform and an online course designed to facilitate the understanding and implementation of the TCO regulation, but also to help HSPs gain a better understanding of terrorist use of the internet and radicalization processes. And finally, best practices materials, in particular a best practice manual and a brochure providing an overview of technical solutions available to HSPs.
Many thanks, Pierre. Now that we have an understanding of both projects, let's discuss some of the challenges faced by HSPs. Pierre, what were the common pitfalls that organizations might encounter when trying to comply with the TCO regulation, and how can they avoid these issues?
I think that the first pitfall that organizations can make when trying to comply with the TCO regulation is to look at compliance as a whole, as a block, if I may say, which of course can be very impressive. And on the contrary, I think you really have to see and understand compliance as a step-by-step process. And this is, by the way, what our second tool, the FRISCO process map, is all about. So first of all, you need to assess your level of compliance, identifying the gaps between the processes and practices you are implementing and those you need to implement to be compliant. Then with the right information in hand, you can easily break down the compliance process, drafting terms of services, designating a point of contact, figuring out how to respond to removal orders, notifying users and setting up complaint mechanisms, implementing specific measures, and finally creating transparency reports. So in general, I think that it is very likely that many platforms have not taken the time to familiarize themselves with the TCO regulation, its categories, logic, and key measures, which can lead to suboptimal practices, I would say. So, of course, I don't blame them. The TCO regulation is not an easy piece of legislation, and its initial intricacy can be daunting for small platforms. And we saw this several times during the project, but many platforms were confused about the regulation. Am I in the scope of the TCO? What should I do to comply? What if I have never encountered terrorist content on my platform? What do I risk, etc.? 2 years ago, many didn't even know about it, and many others were unsure about its scope. If you take, for example, the category of hosting service providers, so the main target of the TCO regulation, I would say it's not obvious, especially with the different translations in all the EU languages and the use of the term hosting, which can be a bit confusing. So, of course, once broken down and presented step by step, the compliance process, the measures and obligations become clearer. However, it is indeed not always easy to translate legal obligations into operational practices or tools. So online platforms should really not hesitate to ask for advice, support, and guidance. And we are here to help. So yes, I think a second pitfall, which is very closely related to the first, is to fall into what we describe in our mapping report as a reactive posture. Most of the small HSPs we surveyed a few months ago clearly lacked the core infrastructure to identify, monitor, and remove the risk content. So logically, the measures required by the TCO regulation were also rarely implemented. And perhaps more worryingly, most of them felt that they were at low risk of being exposed to terrorist content. Whereas we know, thanks to all the data available and the tremendous work of researchers, that small platforms, so in terms of user base or number of employees, are heavily targeted by terrorist actors and organizations. So this is exactly what we call the reactive posture. Despite being unprepared, unequipped, and unaware of the potential risks, several companies clearly told us that they would only consider taking action if they had no other option. So in other words, if they found terrorist content on their services or received a removal order. But prevention is better than cure, and it is when platforms are unaware and unprepared that suboptimal practices can be implemented. For example, if a particular HSP is unaware of its right to appeal and the right it must provide to its users, this could lead to ill-considered or automatic removal of content for fear of receiving a removal order or penalties, for instance. And this is just one example, but it really illustrates how risk can be avoided through information and preparation, and how platforms can help protect digital rights. And in the current conflict-ridden international context, this is a factor that should not be overlooked. And to avoid this pitfall, I must also say here that our respective projects have provided small platforms with a lot of free resources to train themselves, achieve TCO compliance, refine their content moderation processes, and implement best practices. And to conclude on this aspect, I would also like to mention a third pitfall, which is again linked to what I have just said. This pitfall is thinking you are not concerned by the TCO regulation and more generally by the fight against terrorist content online. First, it is important to recall that all platforms with publicly available user-generated content are concerned, as the TCO regulation applies to all HSPs offering their services in the EU. So, of course, unfortunately, we can assume that most platforms will never have to deal with such content. And it is also easy to see why preventing and countering violent extremism can seem far removed from the day-to-day operations of small commercial platforms. But ultimately, it's not true. Platforms of all sizes have an important role to play in protecting users from harmful content and upholding their rights. We know that some platforms are more at risk than others because of the nature of the services they offer, namely file storage, file sharing, archiving, and content pasting. So as an HSP, it may be very useful to carry out a risk assessment based on the services you provide, but in many cases, it is important to understand that terrorist actors use sophisticated and evolving strategies and techniques to disseminate propaganda online, which requires the use of different types of platforms in terms of size and services.
Very interesting and important points indeed. Serena, from your experience with allies, have you encountered similar challenges?
Well, I think Pierre highlighted very detailed also what are the challenges that we face. The two projects have similar scopes and work on similar lines. So I can just agree with everything that Pierre mentioned. One thing that we have encountered also as part of allies, and let's say give a larger perspective to what Pierre has already mentioned, is that, as I was mentioning before, we work with a very specific target audience, which are micro and small host service providers. And what we have seen as one of the main pitfalls by working with this specific target audience is that they have, of course, limited resources per definition and limited technical expertise for what concerns terrorist content online. So they have to really focus their resources on the implementation of their products, and therefore everything that goes out of the scope, let's say, of their organization, it's an additional task that requires time, requires understanding, requires expertise. So it's this limitation of having specific resources to be deployed also affect the implementation of the TCO regulation. So what we have seen as part of our project was that, for instance, we are working for them in order to create an artificial intelligence-based tool that support them in the detection and removal of terrorist content online. So it's extremely important. It was extremely important, and it's still extremely important to engage them and create a channel of communication and engagement strategies that is effective and doesn't take a lot of resources. So one of the effort that we have put a lot in the project was to create these communication and engagement strategies, so that they are able to understand from a very practical and a very effective, on a very effective level, what are the difficulties related to the TCO regulation, how to implement tools and supported mechanism that allows them to implement the TCO regulation into their existing organization without having big resources dedicated to it. Also, what Pierre mentioned before, I think it was one of the challenges that we encountered, is the uncertainty around the scope of the regulation. What is actually the regulation about? We are talking about legal framework, which are sometimes hard to understand and even harder to apply into the specific member state and then the specific duties of the organization. So giving a support in understanding what is the regulation about, what are the barriers that they may encounter when implementing the TCO regulation into their organization practices. It has been hard, and it is still a continuous work, but it is fundamental in order to make the TCO regulation really effective and implementable for this specific target group. So those are, and I think Pierre also, everything that he said was very to the point. So that's just an addition that I would like to make, experiencing the work and the activities and that we have done together with the small and micro host service providers on allies.
I know all three TCO cluster projects have learned valuable lessons. Serena, what are the key lessons from the Allies project that could benefit organizations working to comply with the TCO regulation?
Well, I would say that one of the things, if I would start from the very beginning, again, the ALICE project, and also potentially for future initiative working in the same field, the first step that I would implement is to create a proper cooperation with the micro and small host service providers from the very beginning of the project, from the very beginning of the action, because in the moment where you have to develop tools for your target audience, you have to keep in mind that the tools must be scalable and flexible in order to be adaptable from the specific end user, from the specific host service providers. So collaboration and knowledge sharing, understanding what are the requirements, what are the needs, what are the barriers from their perspective, what is also the reality in the specific member states, because as you know, we talk about terrorist content online as a whole, but in reality, the issues faced by specific member states can be very different. So understanding what is the exact reality that we are talking about, what is the exact barrier that for instance, specific organization is facing is the basis in order to implement a proper action and to give them the necessary tools and knowledge in order to implement properly the TCO regulation. Also, I think another important lessons that has been proved to be extremely helpful is the creation of synergies. We have, for instance, you mentioned at the beginning, Sophia, the creation of the TCO cluster. The TCO cluster, as you say, it's a synergy among different initiatives. In this specific case, ALICE, FRISCO, and TATE. We all worked on similar challenges with the same target audience. So creating cooperation and knowledge sharing has been proved to be extremely beneficial. For instance, just to give an example on how practically beneficial this cooperation can be, all the three initiatives had to target wanted to target micro and small host service providers, and they said it is a tricky audience to engage. So we had to be careful in first, from one hand, to engage them properly. On the other hand, not to overlap, step over one another, let's say. So creating mechanism of understanding how to contact them, who to contact them, how to make the knowledge of one project being beneficial also for the other projects and learn from each other has been, in my opinion, extremely beneficial. And I really think that when talking about a niche such as this one, like the TCO regulation, and specifically a niche of target audience like micro and small host service providers, this cooperation among initiatives, cooperation with member states, national authorities, and among projects and European Commission is very valuable.
Yeah, I fully agree from my perspective. Understanding the bigger picture and collaboration are key to be able to act towards the joint goal of making the online environment safer. Pierre, what lessons from the FRISCO project would you like to share that could help organizations navigate the challenges of the TCO regulation?
Thank you very much, Sophia. So first, I, of course, do agree with you and with what Serena just said. I'm going to try also not to repeat too much and maybe highlight additional lessons to complete the picture here. So I don't know if it can be considered as a lesson learned per se, but I would maybe like to start by highlighting that compliance with the TCO regulation should not be seen as an independent issue standing on its own. I think it is really part of a wider multifaceted area, which is PCVE. And to prevent and counter violent extremism, you need a two-pronged approach. First, you need to know what you are up against, which means gaining a better understanding of the threat landscape and how terrorists use the internet. And secondly, as an online platform, you need to be equipped with the appropriate information, resources, and capacities to tackle the exploitation of your services and comply with the EU regulations. I think that these two dimensions are often separated. This is both logical and unfortunate, as the two dimensions should really complement each other. I would say that PCV is really a team effort, and the different stakeholders should feed off each other, basically. And once again, I do believe that small online platforms should adopt a proactive approach on both aspects, and that the first one, the knowledge of the threat, is maybe too often neglected. I think that's a shame, even if I'm, of course, not advocating for every HSPs or IT professionals to become a subject matter expert. There are a lot to learn on how trends from the threat landscape could turn into operational practices. For instance, if we look at content moderation, terrorist groups often use codes, symbols, or hidden references that you need to know in order to be efficient. This leads me to a second lesson learned. Terrorist content is not necessarily what you think. In the end, it is quite diverse. Objective pursuits are multiple and things are changing fast. I think we all have in mind I would say the cliche of terrorist content, beheading video from the Islamic State, for example, but terrorist content is not limited to these extreme examples. If we go back to the TCO regulation definitions, you basically have 4 cases of what can be considered terrorist content. First, designation. So content attributable to or disseminated on behalf of an entity included in the union list of persons, groups, and entities involved in terrorist acts. So Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or the base, for instance. Second, you've got glorification. So content relating to the glorification and incitement of terrorism, terrorist offenses, or terrorist attacks. Third, solicitation. So this category is the one that remains the most open to interpretation, but it is basically materials that solicit someone to commit a terrorist offense, and recruitment also falls under that category. And finally, we've got instruction. So instructional materials are the most straightforward. It can be material produced by a designated terrorist group, including bomb making manuals, 3D printed weapons manuals, etc., etc. So in general, I think it is important to learn more about the subject, for example, by listening to the Tech Terror podcast, of course. And if I may, I think that particular attention should be paid to emerging threats, online gaming and gamification, borderline content, all the aesthetic and ideological crossovers, and ill-defined content such as generative AI and the metaverse, and etc. And to conclude, my third lesson, is the collective aspect of compliance with the TCO regulation, and more generally, the collective aspect of PCVE. And this is really in line with what Serena has said. So the more you look into the subject, the more you realize the multitude of players involved: European institutions and Europol, law enforcement agencies and regulators, online platforms, of course, but also solution providers, users, and even the civil society at large, just to name a few. So each of these players has a role to play. Disrupting online terror is a team effort. And when we talk about these issues, I don't think we should neglect partnerships, which can be more or less informal, by the way, but in the end prove very useful. And this is something we've really worked hard on at FRISCO, and obviously with you guys through the creation of the TCO cluster. So the creation of a dedicated ecosystem really helps to circulate information and find innovative solutions to complex problems. If we look at the removal order mechanism alone, we see that at least 4 or 5 different players are involved. The user, the online platform, the competent authority, the regulator, and Europol. So my advice is therefore, once again, do not hesitate to turn to specialists and third parties, because compliance cannot be achieved without an effort of information and preparation. And I believe partnerships also fall under this category. So I would even add that this compliance can be achieved quite easily if you invest some time and know where to look for information.
Yeah, it's definitely a point that terrorist actors are quite adept and quick in adapting to changing online environments, which is why I'd like to echo that continuous learning is key to counter and prevent the threat, and where I think the 3 projects can step in very well. Next, let's shift to best practices. Pierre, based on your experience with the FRISCO project, what best practices could you recommend to HSPs and IT professionals, especially those working in smaller organizations, to ensure compliance with the TCO regulation?
as I said earlier, I think a fundamental aspect is to understand compliance with the TCO regulation as a step-by-step process and not as a block. So the whole process and the logic behind the TCO regulation becomes clearer when you break down your obligations into smaller pieces, from the exposure to series content to transparency reports. And with regard to good practices, I would definitely refer your auditors here to the FRISCO best practice manual, which is entitled Countering Terrorist Content Online, a best practice guide for hosting service providers. This is really an essential and extensive guide based on research, training, and tools from the FRISCO project, which also includes insights from VLOPs, industry associations, experts, and LEAs. So you've got 6 chapters of best practices, case studies, tips, and examples. And yes, this is a comprehensive guide for HSPs to understand the legal framework and tackle harmful content online. So it provides practical advice and step-by-step guidance on key aspects of compliance, such as drafting terms and conditions and policies that prohibit terrorist content, designating a point of contact or legal representative, responding to removal orders from national authorities, notifying users and establishing a complaint mechanism, implementing specific measures to detect and prevent the dissemination of terrorist content, and drafting transparency reports. And furthermore, this manual has been published jointly with another guide, so a brochure called Tools and Approaches for Small HSPs to Address Terrorist Content Online, which provides an overview of the technical solutions available to HSPs, so to say tools, softwares, etc. And of course, this can be very useful for HSPs and IT professionals who thus benefit from a snapshot of the commercial options available to them. And maybe to conclude on this point, I would like to make a few additional recommendations. Firstly, look into the legal issues and obligations for HSPs. Most of the educational resources produced by FRISCO, Lies and Tech Against Terrorism Europe are available for free on our respective websites. Second, take proactive measures to protect your services from potential exploitation. A good place to start is by looking at the specific measures outlined in the TCO regulation, I believe. And thirdly, establish partnerships and learn best practices from larger platforms with more experience in content moderation and related issues. So there are also some useful tools available. I can think, for instance, of the Asher Matcher Actioner developed by Meta.
Serena, what best practices have emerged from your work with allies that you would like to recommend to smaller platforms looking to meet the TCO requirements?
So once again, I think Pierre gave a very comprehensive answer to this question, which is also very aligned with the findings and the work implemented as part of allies. Maybe one thing that we have learned to be an important best practice is the creation of training material and educational support for host service providers in this field. As also Pierre mentioned, terrorist content is and terrorism in general, it's an evolving phenomenon, and it changes depending on the historical moment, on the specific geographical location. Therefore, providing training which can be adapted and having the opportunity to continuously work on material that can be then adopted and provided to micro small host service providers is extremely important and vital, not just of course in regard to the TCO regulation itself, but also in regard to the phenomenon itself, how it works, how it operates, what are the points that should be highlighted, should be focused on. So this is has been one of the work that Allies and also all the 3 projects actually have implemented and put a lot of effort on, and I think it's extremely valuable. The other thing, also a bit looking at this topic in the lens of the Allies project, is leveraging existing technologies in order to work and properly adapt also on this phenomenon. There are already artificial intelligence-based tools available. Other are in implementation, such as what Allies is doing. There is existing technologies, and there are tools that can be used by host service providers in order to implement the TCO and be in compliance with it. So leveraging this knowledge is something that definitely should be taken into consideration. Lastly, that was previously mentioned also in the previous answer, is the cooperation with national authorities. There are a lot of initiatives. Once the TCO regulation has been established on a member state level, a lot of action has been taken, and national authorities are working into the direction in order to support the service providers, in order to make clear what is the threat and what are the compliance procedures for it. So being proactive from the host service providers in order to understand what is already out there and can be exploited and used from a national point of view is also something important, in my opinion.
To wrap up our discussion, if there is one key takeaway you would like our listeners to remember from your project, what would it be? How is it for allies, Serena?
I think one takeaway from allies, from all the big work that has been done as part of the project, is that also Pierre mentioned before, compliance with the TCO regulation is actually achievable, and it is achievable also for macro small host service providers, and especially for them. So summing up a bit also what has been said before, use tools, use the training material available, use the knowledge available that has been created in order to understand how it works, how it can be implemented in an effective way. Also considering that currently we are talking about the terrorist content online, of course, and the TCO regulation, but a similar framework can be, or a similar threat has been seen growing also in other fields, such as hate speech or the dissemination of hate content online. And these kind of threats are, especially in this moment of time, are growing very fast. And frameworks and tools that allow to have a safe environment is fundamental. Therefore, being proactive, because proactivity allow to make achievable the implementation of the TCO and having, in general terms, a safer online environment.
And finally, Pierre, what is the key takeaway for FRISCO?
Thank you, Sophia. So first, of course, I agree with what Serena has just said. And in addition to the resources we have produced, which I hope will be useful to as many stakeholders as possible, I would personally like to emphasize the collective and multifaceted aspect of the fight against online terror. And once again, it is important to understand that compliance with the TCO regulation is a little bit the tip of the iceberg. It's a key element, but one element among many in the field of PCV and content terrorism. It is also important to remember that there is no watertight separation between what happens online and what happens offline. So terrorist actors use the internet to disseminate propaganda, recruit and fund their activities, but the dissemination of terrorist content online does have an impact in the real world. So the dichotomy between offline and online activities is a myth or a misconception, both in terms of radicalization processes and attack planning, as terrorists tend to operate in both spheres. So as research has shown, the internet really acts as a facilitating tool that is used for instrumental purposes. So in conclusion, I'd like to reiterate the importance of building partnerships, developing knowledge of trends, emerging threats, and the weaponization of disruptive technologies, and supporting small platforms to move away from the reactive stance, the reactive posture we both mentioned during the podcast. In short, I think we still need to continue bridging the gap between policy, practice, research, and law enforcement, while ensuring that digital rights are protected.
Thank you so much, Pierre and Serena, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. It's been fascinating to learn more about the Allies and FRISCO projects and the important work you're doing to support HSPs in complying with the TCO regulation. Thanks a lot for all this valuable work. For our listeners, don't forget to check the show notes where you will find a link to available resources and the great work being done by the Allies and FRISCO projects. Also, to add to the legacy of the TCO cluster projects beyond the individual project conclusions, we have created a joint online repository comprising resources from Allies FRISCO and from us from Tate, where you can find all learning resources and support material. So be sure to check that out as well. As always, thank you for listening. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.